On a sweltering August night in 1856, 19-year-old Sarah Fletcher watched from the shadows as the Thornton family celebrated their eldest son's engagement in the grand ballroom of Thornton Hall. Within hours, that same ballroom would become the scene of a mysterious fire that claimed 5 lives, while Sarah disappeared into the Mississippi darkness, leaving behind only a silver serving tray bearing the family crest and whispers of the shadow servant of Vicksburg that would haunt the region for generations. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button to brighten my day and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The Thornton estate occupied a commanding hilltop position overlooking the Mississippi River, its Greek revival mansion serving as a monument to wealth extracted from 3 acres of cotton fields and the labor of 175 enslaved souls. Colonel Marcus Thornton had built his fortune through shrewd business dealings and ruthless efficiency, creating an operation that other planners studied and envied. His wife, Arabella, possessed the refined manners of Charleston aristocracy and the calculating mind of a military strategist, managing the household slaves with precision that would have impressed a general organizing troops for battle. Their children had inherited both parents' worst qualities while developing cruel innovations of their own. 22-year-old James showed promise as heir to the plantation empire, combining his father's business acumen with a taste for psychological torture that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. 18-year-old Carolyn cultivated an appearance of delicate femininity while orchestrating elaborate schemes to humiliate and degrade the house servants. 15-year-old Thomas, the youngest, compensated for his father's disappointed expectations with creative displays of casual violence that announced his determination to prove his manhood through domination of those weaker than himself. Sarah Fletcher had been born during a cholera outbreak that claimed her mother and 2 siblings, leaving her in the care of Mama Ruth, the plantation's head cook and surrogate mother to dozens of orphaned children whose parents had been sold away or worked to death. Ruth taught Sarah to read using Bible verses copied onto scraps of paper, a dangerous gift that could result in severed fingers or worse if discovered. But Sarah possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the plantation's boundaries, memorizing every scrap of information that filtered down to the quarters and building a detailed mental map of possibilities that might lead to freedom. By age 16, Sarah had been promoted from kitchen work to personal maid for Caroline Thornton, a position that brought her into constant contact with the family's casual cruelty. She witnessed Marcus's cold calculation in separating families for profit, Arabella's refined torture disguised as household management, and the children's competitive cruelty as they vied to surpass each other in devising punishments for perceived infractions. Every day reinforced that she was property rather than person, an object whose value derived entirely from her usefulness, to owners who viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of maintaining their lifestyle. The summer of 1856 arrived with oppressive heat that transformed the Mississippi Valley into a furnace, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees for weeks without relief. The plantation's ice house, built deep underground with thick brick walls, became essential for preserving food and providing ice for the cooling drinks that made the heat bearable for the White family. Marcus had invested heavily in the structure, creating a sophisticated system of ventilation and drainage that maintained freezing temperatures even during the hottest months. Sarah's assignment to icehouse duty came as punishment for what Arabella called insufficient enthusiasm in her service, though Sarah's only crime had been failing to smile while Caroline deliberately spilled hot tea on her arm. The work was brutally difficult, requiring her to spend hours in the frigid chamber organizing supplies and maintaining the ice blocks that preserved the family's comfort. Her thin cotton dress provided inadequate protection against temperatures that dropped to near zero, turning her breath to fog and numbing her fingers until she could barely grip the tools she needed. But the icehouse offered something precious that Sarah had rarely experienced in her 19 years of bondage: solitude. Away from the constant surveillance and calculated humiliation of the main house, she found moments to think clearly about her situation and consider possibilities for escape. She began hiding small items in corners of the chamber: a box of matches, strips of dried meat, a warm shawl stolen from the laundry, building a cache that might prove useful if opportunity ever arose. Marcus took disturbing interest in Sarah's icehouse duties, arriving unannounced to inspect her work while standing too close and making comments about her appearance that left her feeling violated. His inspections sometimes involved touches that crossed from inappropriate to criminal, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against her neck as he whispered threats about what happened to slave girls who didn't properly appreciate their master's attention. Carolyn's cruelty was more psychologically sophisticated, involving elaborate games designed to humiliate Sarah in front of other servants while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. As the oppressive summer continued, Sarah began noticing patterns in the family's behavior that suggested vulnerabilities she might exploit. Marcus's drinking had increased to the point where he struggled to navigate stairs after dinner, while Arabella had started taking increasingly large doses of laudanum to manage what she called her delicate nerves. The children, despite their precocious cruelty, remained young enough to be controlled by fears they didn't fully understand. The opportunity Sarah had unconsciously been preparing for arrived on August 15, 1856, when the Thorntons announced an elaborate engagement celebration for James and his intended bride, the daughter of a wealthy New Orleans merchant family. The event was crucial for solidifying business relationships and demonstrating the Thorntons' continued ascension in Mississippi society. Preparations consumed the household for weeks, with every detail scrutinized and every servant working extended hours to ensure perfection. On the night of the celebration, the mansion blazed with light from hundreds of candles and oil lamps, illuminating rooms decorated with flowers and silk bunting. Nearly 100 guests filled the ballroom, dining hall, and parlors, consuming elaborate foods and expensive wines while the family basked in admiration from their peers. Sarah moved through the crowd serving drinks and clearing plates, invisible except when someone wanted to demonstrate their authority by issuing unnecessary orders or making cruel jokes at her expense. As the evening progressed, Sarah overheard a conversation between Marcus and Arabella that froze her blood. They were discussing her recent behavior, which they characterized as increasingly bold despite her careful efforts to remain unnoticed. They had decided Sarah needed a lesson that would permanently cure her of any illusions about her status. The punishment they planned was designed to break both body and spirit. She would be locked overnight in the ice house wearing only her thin cotton dress, without shoes or covering to protect her from temperatures that could kill within hours. Caroline added her own refinements, suggesting they invite James's fiancée to witness the punishment as entertainment for the wedding party the following morning. If Sarah survived the night, she would serve as an object lesson about proper submission. If she died, they would simply purchase a replacement at the next slave market in Natchez. The Thornton children laughed at their parents' creativity, already imagining the stories they would tell about the night they taught an uppity slave girl her proper place. But as the family discussed their plans with obvious pleasure, Sarah was forming a different kind of plan. She had spent months in the ice house learning its secrets, understanding how air circulated through the ventilation system where the oil lamps that lit the entrance were stored, and how the wooden support beams that held the ceiling had dried over years of temperature extremes until they would burn despite the chamber's frigid interior. Around midnight, as the party reached its peak with guests dancing and drinking with abandon, Marcus announced it was time to administer Sarah's punishment. The entire family, along with several close friends who were staying overnight, made their way through the sultry darkness toward the ice house. Their lanterns cast dancing shadows across the grounds while cicadas sang their summer chorus, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. Inside the frigid chamber, the temperature provided shocking relief from the oppressive heat outside. Marcus pushed Sarah roughly toward the center of the space, explaining her punishment with obvious satisfaction. She would spend the night locked in this frozen tomb, he announced, wearing nothing but her thin dress. If she survived until dawn, perhaps she would have learned proper gratitude. If she died, she was simply property that had outlived its usefulness. Arabella stepped forward to remove Sarah's thin shawl, noting that slaves needed to earn warmth through obedient service. The guests watched with fascinated horror, some clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge their host's treatment of his property. Caroline giggled while imagining how she would describe Sarah's suffering to her friends at future social gatherings. But as Marcus turned toward the door, preparing to lock Sarah inside the crystalline tomb, she spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the excited chatter of the assembled witnesses. She asked, with apparent humility, whether she might be permitted to extinguish the oil lamps they had brought into the ice house, as leaving them burning in the closed chamber might create dangerous fumes that could harm the family if they ever needed to use the space themselves. Marcus paused, confused by what seemed like genuine concern from someone about to face potentially fatal punishment. Several guests nodded approvingly at Sarah's thoughtfulness, interpreting her question as evidence of proper training. Arabella laughed, pointing out that they had more lamps than they could ever need, and Sarah would certainly never use this space again after tonight. The children added their own cruel observations about the difference between masters who commanded resources and slaves who used whatever their betters permitted. Sarah nodded as if accepting their response, then moved with practiced efficiency to extinguish the nearest lamp. As she did so, she stumbled deliberately, knocking the lamp against one of the wooden support beams that held the icehouse ceiling. Hot oil splashed across the dried timber, and within seconds, flames began licking up the ancient wood despite the chamber's frigid temperature. Chaos erupted as guests realized the chamber was catching fire. Marcus roared orders to extinguish the flames, but the oil had spread too quickly, igniting additional support beams and filling the underground space with acrid smoke. Sarah moved through the confusion like a shadow, slipping past panicked guests toward the heavy wooden door. Before anyone could react, she had stepped through the entrance and slammed the barrier shut behind her, trapping the entire Thornton family and their overnight guests inside the burning chamber. The massive iron key turned in the lock with a sound like thunder, followed by screams of fury and terror as those trapped inside realized what had happened. Marcus's voice shook the walls as he threw himself against the door, demanding Sarah unlock the chamber immediately. Arabella's screams joined her husband's, alternating between threats of horrific torture and promises of mercy if Sarah would just open the door. But Sarah was already running through the darkness toward the slave quarters, her stolen shoes silent against the packed earth paths she had memorized during years of service. The main house stood mostly empty, with only skeleton staff remaining while the family and guests celebrated. Sarah moved through familiar rooms gathering supplies, gold coins and paper money from Marcus's study, warm clothing and sturdy boots from Arabella's wardrobe, small valuables from the children's rooms that could be traded for necessities. Most importantly, she spent time in the plantation office altering documents that recorded her legal status, using literacy skills Mama Ruth had taught her to transform herself from enslaved property to freed person. As she worked by candlelight, Sarah could hear distant screams from the direction of the ice house. The fire had apparently spread despite the chamber's underground construction, and smoke was pouring from the ventilation shafts. She felt no pleasure in their suffering, but neither did she experience guilt. They had chosen to use the ice house as a weapon against her, and she had simply demonstrated that weapons could be turned against those who wielded them. Before dawn, Sarah made her way to the stables where Marcus's horses waited. She selected a strong gelding named Thunder, who recognized her from daily care duties and accepted her authority without question. As the sun rose over the Mississippi River, painting the water gold and crimson, Sarah rode away from the only home she had ever known. Behind her, smoke still rose from the ice house where the Thornton family and their guests had perished from either fire or suffocation. Their bodies would not be discovered until later that morning, when servants finally realized something was terribly wrong. By then, Sarah was 20 miles away, following roads she had memorized from studying maps in Marcus's office. The journey north took Sarah through Tennessee and Kentucky, following routes used by other escaped slaves seeking freedom in territories where slavery was forbidden. She traveled mostly at night, hiding during daylight hours and using her forged documents to pass casual inspection by patrols searching for runaways. The altered papers identified her as Sarah Washington, a freed woman from Nashville traveling to visit relatives in Cincinnati. Her transformation from enslaved girl to free woman required more than forged documents and stolen horses. Sarah had to remake herself completely, learning to walk and speak with the confidence of someone accustomed to freedom, studying how free blacks conducted themselves in public spaces and developing the psychological armor necessary to maintain her deception under scrutiny. Cincinnati in 1856 was a bustling river port where Southern commerce met Northern industry, creating opportunities for those brave enough and clever enough to seize them. Sarah found work in a seamstress shop owned by a Quaker woman who asked few questions about her background but clearly understood she was running from something. The work was demanding but honest, with regular wages that allowed Sarah to rent a small room while saving money for the next stage of her journey to truly free territory. But even in Ohio, Sarah could not entirely escape the shadow of her past. The Fugitive Slave Act made every interaction potentially dangerous, requiring federal officials to assist in hunting down escaped slaves, even in free states. Rewards for her capture appeared in newspapers throughout the region, describing her as wanted for questioning about the mysterious fire that had killed the Thornton family and their guests. The descriptions were frighteningly accurate, suggesting that someone from the plantation had provided detailed information about her appearance. The reward had grown to $1,000, an enormous sum that would attract every professional bounty hunter within 500 miles. More ominously, the notices suggested deliberate murder rather than accidental death, transforming Sarah from runaway slave into fugitive from capital crimes. When Union victory in the Civil War finally abolished slavery throughout the nation, Sarah was living in Detroit under the name Elizabeth Freeman, operating a successful dressmaking business that served both black and white customers. The war's conclusion meant she could finally consider herself truly free, no longer subject to recapture and return to bondage. She had built a comfortable life through determination and skill, proving that formerly enslaved people could thrive when given the opportunity. But Sarah never forgot the night she had trapped her oppressors in the burning ice house, turning their intended weapon against them. The memory haunted her dreams for decades, not because she regretted her actions, but because she understood the terrible price freedom had demanded. She had chosen survival over submission, her own life over the lives of her torturers, and she carried that choice like a scar that never fully healed. In 1905, at age 68, Sarah finally returned to Mississippi to confront her past. The Thornton estate lay in ruins, its mansion long since demolished and its fields reclaimed by forest. But the ice house remained, its brick walls too solid to succumb to time and weather. She stood before the scarred entrance, remembering the desperate screams that had echoed from within as flames consumed those who had intended to freeze her to death. Sarah lived another 20 years, dying peacefully in Detroit in 1925 at age 88. She left behind a substantial estate that she donated to schools serving Detroit's African American community, along with a sealed document containing her complete story. When that account was finally opened and studied by historians, decades later, it sparked intense debate about the methods she had used to secure her freedom and the moral complexity of violence employed against oppression. The story of Sarah Fletcher, who became Elizabeth Freeman, stands as testament to the countless unnamed heroes who fought for their freedom during America's darkest chapters. Her methods were extreme, but her cause was just, and her ultimate success proved that even the most powerless could find ways to claim the freedom that was their birthright. The shadow servant of Vicksburg had transformed herself into a successful businesswoman and community leader, demonstrating that the human spirit could triumph over even the most dehumanizing circumstances when armed with courage, intelligence, and absolute determination to survive. Her legacy reminds us that freedom is never free, that justice sometimes requires choices that challenge comfortable assumptions about right and wrong, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it and courage permits it. Sarah's story continues to inspire those who study resistance to oppression, serving as a powerful reminder that the path to freedom is rarely simple or morally pure, but always worth pursuing for those brave enough to pay its price.